it's me, IHE, and welcome to my assessment of all the superhero movies from the disastrous year that was 2020. This is an annual video series that documents my thoughts on the ever-growing collection of these films that are being pumped out every year, in a frivolous attempt to document if they're generally getting better, more tiresome, or simply staying the same. This year was unusual because it's the first one of these videos where the overwhelming, and I mean overwhelming, majority of superhero movies ranged from fairly bad to embarrassingly bad. 2020 was also the first year since 2009 that didn't have a single MCU Marvel movie. Not that there wasn't anything on the docket, but it goes to show just how much weight Marvel is carrying in terms of quality. So we're left with the knockoffs this year. It was kind of a knockoff year. When I started this series, I foolishly assumed that these lists of movies would be somewhat manageable, forgetting that the string of copycats and trend chasers hunting the MCU treasure chest would eventually swell until we're left with a selection of movies such as this. The overexposure is getting so ridiculous at this point that Google assumes that the terrible Scoob and the Sonic movie count as superhero movies. I guess technically they are, but hey, I'm not including them here because I'm just not gonna do that. Besides, there are still 12 of these I settled on to talk about, starting with my least favorite and working up to my most least favorite. Wait, that doesn't make sense. This movie is 1 minute shorter than The Dark Knight. Think about how much is accomplished in the same amount of screen time, with a fairly similar budget, both DC movies even. But the distance in quality could not be wider. Conceptually, I hate pretty much everything about this movie. However, the most alarming decision to me was the complete lack of tonal consistency, which is one of the most essential aspects to a superhero movie.
Very powerful.
I'm perfectly fine with a Sam Raimi-esque, goofy, over-the-top, cartoonish Wonder Woman movie. In fact, I believe it would be one of the better ways to make this character work on the big screen.
Sometimes we do.
Right.
Have a nice day.
But those are cool. I like those. Animal print.
As opposed to having a touch of the ridiculous, sandwiched between a story that takes itself way too seriously, with some of the laziest writing I've seen in a superhero movie of this scale.
Whoa.
Either tell a 90-minute, bank robber punching, campy, 80s Bronze Age comic superhero story, or a slower, character-focused action drama that is supposed to fit into a greater universe and truly develop the character to make us more invested in her and her plight. Because when you have both going on at once, they clash against each other very powerfully.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Saw a couple magazine pictures that.
And creates a muddy direction that feels like it was written in a weekend and fleshed out as they went along. Duct taping with reshoots and post-production tinkering that feels like they didn't have anything finalized while they were shooting it. The amount of times this movie establishes crucial plot elements or MacGuffins in the very same scene they were established almost becomes a running gag at a certain point. Like, do they even care? The fact they felt the need to shove in details like the invisible jet, then instantly abandoning it in favor of randomly giving her the powers of flight, even though the movies set after this don't seem to include this ability? I don't really know what's happening with this universe. This movie just doesn't care about the details, so in response, neither do I. They had to put in the work to make Wonder Woman interesting here, because on her own, she doesn't have a lead actor who's charismatic enough,
There's no heaven.
or the innate power gimmicks to keep the action and suspense fun, at least without being in the hands of great action directors or choreographers. It's yet another example of a sequel that was only made because they needed a sequel, because the first one did so well. It's sad too, there was loads of room to improve on that first movie, not make it worse.
Yeah.
The original movie relied on Diana being a fish out of water, which was an easy way to crack jokes and provide some levity in a setting as dire as World War I. Now, the fish out of water element does return in the form of the reincorporation of Chris Pine's character, which provides awkward, misplaced nostalgia for the unremembered 80s that could be completely removed from the movie with very little changing. The 80s aesthetic is mostly for marketing and because 80s iconography is still in vogue in pop culture because we're nostalgia-obsessed freaks. As I mentioned, Chris Pine is back from the dead thanks to a magic stone that can do anything the script needs. This stone MacGuffin is a great example of how not to incorporate magic powers that can do anything into your superhero story. Just keep the rules consistent, that's all I'm after. And when you establish them, at least try to make an effort to keep the audience filled in. or don't. Choose if that's an important aspect of your story instead of using a MacGuffin to solve any hurdle that comes up.
What? Why?
Because when it's presented in the film, like how Chris Pine is brought back by a wish, where the film goes out of its way to show that some random guy who looks a bit like Chris Pine is magically inhabited by his soul, I guess? They romantically reconnect through magic at the expense of this random guy who was presumably living his life until he lost his consciousness to Chris Pine. You could say I'm overthinking it, but the entire movie works this way. It's just sloppy and nothing fits together comfortably. Like once the bad guy of the movie, one of the bad guys of the movie, Max Lord, wishes to be the stone itself.
I wish to be you, the dream stone itself.
And starts controlling people and escalating the situation so we have an excuse for a stupid, epic global conflict that's going to end the entire world. You just get so bored. Oh, it's so boring, because none of it connects, and you're waiting for some kind of story to begin, for these disparate threads to connect in a way that feels natural, for some kind of dynamic to push some personality or drama into this. But it never evolves above Saturday morning cartoon, and not the cool kind, the baby kind. Why not give her an arc that's more about her as a character? Maybe she isn't instantly capable against everything she faces. Put her up against someone that tests her in ways we haven't seen before, or brings out a unique slant of any kind. Honestly, you could even take a story of her having to let go of the pain she's been holding on to for too long and make that into something truly inspiring and fitting with the hope the character is supposed to resemble. And I'm sure that's what they were going for, but the execution is so messy. I just want a Wonder Woman story that when it ends, it feels like you've been on a true adventure and witnessed her grow, lose, and learn. More in line with the first movie, I guess. So you need to make an effort to characterize her into someone that resembles more than just a truth whip, an invisible jet, and a suit of armor, and focus more on the truth, justice, and equality she's supposed to inspire, and apply that to a narrative where her actions actually reinforce the underlying philosophy of the character, without feeling the need to shove in awful, corny dialogue that treats you like a child.
And you cannot have it all. You can only have the truth.
There are decades worth of source material. I refuse to believe there's not a decent Wonder Woman story that could be adapted into a solid sequel to that first movie. The opening scene of 1984 does a fantastic job of highlighting every problem this film has. First off, it's conceptually weak. It's a flashback where Wonder Woman and her friends play total wipeout and has basically nothing to do with the rest of the movie. Its priority seems to be on the scope of the action and to hammer home the overarching theme of don't take shortcuts, kids. Even though in this instance her shortcut is presented to us as kind of an ingenious and quick-witted solution, where she utilizes some conveniently placed drainage slides after being knocked off her horse in an accident. We've never seen this game before, so the rules aren't clear, and it's a little girl going up against a squad of grown women, so subconsciously you're already going to be on the child's side. They needed to emphasize her doing something actually morally complicated. She's a child, you can show her making mistakes and learning from them in a way that isn't so messily told. You cannot be the winner because you're not ready to win, is the logic to what she's told. And in a vacuum is good advice, until you match it with what we've just been shown, because Diana is a superpowered, gifted child who can clearly compete against Amazons that dwarf her in age and stature. It doesn't work when the main character says something is unfair when we don't even know the rules to the situation that would make it fair. It doesn't even fill the role of the exciting opening action sequence because right after this we get the jewel thief scene, which scratches that exact same itch, in a better way. The film would simply be improved without this entire sequence. It would get things moving faster, wouldn't needlessly hammer home the theme, and wouldn't feel like a waste of time. According to the director and writer Patty Jenkins, it's supposed to provide the foundation for her moment during her final speech. It's about these complex observations you have to make during life in order to become a true hero. I love that she doesn't understand that until that final speech.
Renounce your wish.
The studio even agreed with me, but Jenkins fought to include both opening action scenes, adding to that completely justified runtime that I'm needlessly hung up on. 2.5 hours though, come on. Come on, you gotta earn that. It's like they're too scared to give her true flaws. I don't actually know what her weaknesses are or why we should care about the stakes in any action she's in. I don't even know why I'm supposed to like her. Because she's invincible and nice and has a boyfriend who is in the Great War? Which gets me onto yet another huge problem. Why is the action this bad? It's genuinely the one thing I expect at a minimum with these movies. You are spending money the likes of which an average person can't even comprehend. Monopoly money on such a bullshit scale that there's no excuse for the quality of the action in this action movie. The original movie wasn't great in this regard either, but even then it was much better than what you get here. The worst example is the convoy attack, where the two leads happen to stumble across the bad guy. It devolves into a level of action schlock that is almost commendable. When Wonder Woman is slow-mo catching bullets with the whip and running 80 down a highway, it really hits you how poorly conceived this entire story was. And if that's not enough, by the 2-hour mark where you're just desperate for it to be over, of course it has to devolve into the superhero fighting an evil CG version of themselves in a clusterfuck of CG that is hidden by a setting so dark that you can't distinguish anything. Kristen Wiig is in this. She's Cheetah. Get it? Because cheating is bad and that's what the movie is about. Fuck. I can't believe we're still getting movies where the conventionally attractive actor is cast as the unpopular nerd who everyone ignores and hates for no reason, who then is suddenly popular and appreciated and ripped because she has a magical makeover. It's like a bunch of tropes stitched together. My final major point on this movie is the bloat. I was always under the impression that it was usually incentivized to keep a nice, manageable runtime on your big, dumb blockbuster so you could show it more times in a day at the theater and keep costs under control, coupled with the misconception that bigger automatically equals better, and with streaming services not requiring the same restrictions, it's rare to see one of these superhero movies come in under 2 hours at this point. I mentioned The Dark Knight earlier, and there's a reason that film doesn't feel its length, where Wonder Woman 84 drags so painfully. Something as amorphous as pacing or timing can be hard to explain. The flow of the story and how scenes are balanced against each other through editing and writing, and so many different technical elements is the true magic of what this is all about. When you see great storytelling, it emotionally connects and leaves an impression on you that you'll remember. I get none of that from this movie. When there is action, I'm so uninvested that I'm bored by the absence of tension. When there's dialogue, it's so full of meaningless platitudes about truth or heavy exposition that comes out of left field. I don't know what to like about this movie. I basically like nothing about it. How are we still getting superhero movies of this level from studios with this much influence and power? WB have an ever-growing catalogue of studio fuck-ups on a level I've never seen before. Even though there are a couple of good DC movies from this era that have slipped through the shit-at-the-wall approach they've gone for, it's sad at how much missed potential there is with this universe, because ultimately, Wonder Woman 1984 is totally missable, completely forgettable, filled with so much ham-fisted commentary, and every positive is weighed down by so many negatives that talking about this film is actually maddening, because it went so wrong. It has no emotional center that feels genuine, and I cannot connect with anything that happens. Sometimes when there's a really bad, really terrible movie that has one good thing that stands out in it, everyone overly praises the kind of okay thing. And it happened with this movie, where everyone was praising Pedro Pascal. Now, he is no doubt the most entertaining aspect of this movie. The actor oozes charisma and is clearly having fun with such a fluffy role. But I see it more as a waste, where these are the kind of actors that are able to elevate pulp into something that resonates, and it sucks that his talents were wasted on a script with so little going on. The after-credits sequence where they reference the campy show as if this movie is carrying on the legacy or vibe is a fitting note. There was so little going on with this movie that its own mid-credit sequence has a pointless reference that only seems to be included because of its pointless 80s setting. I'll die before I watch this movie again. Another X-Men movie to feel sorry for, yet another project caught in the cogs of the megacorp buyout battles. But even without the Fox buyout, this movie has had a rough history. We're talking about a story that has been in development since around 2015, once The Fault in Our Stars director Josh Boone was attached to create a young adult spin-off X-Men trilogy based on the New Mutants comics. Originally slated for April 2018, coupled with the trailer that made it look as if they were continuing to try something different with the X-Men formula, this time seemingly finally going for an original horror thriller. The movie that was being made behind the scenes was more leaning on the young adult angle, but this trailer was cut together as more of a response to the success of It by rival WB, so then everyone expected a horror movie. The story changed multiple times behind the scenes as the producers at Fox wildly changed their plans to avoid cannibalizing their other superhero output. The time period the movie was set in changed to avoid any links to X-Men Apocalypse after its bad reception, eventually leading to so much time passing that the idea of reshoots was shot down because the main cast had aged too much. Finally, in March of 2020, right as the pandemic was starting to dig its claws in, the film was completed, but delayed. Again, because we couldn't go to theaters anymore. Finally, in August 2020, the film was stealth released and about 5 people saw it. In a desperate attempt to avoid creating another fan four-stick, they kind of made it a self-fulfilling prophecy and created an industry fuck-up that would make WB blush. This film reflects so poorly on the studio's lack of creative direction, letting a project spiral this out of control for so many years. No film should have 5 release dates. What are you doing?
In your dreams.
So how did the movie come together? Well,
You know who the X-Men are, right?
Yeah.
it's a generic, tame, cheap, TV quality X-Men movie that feels completely throwaway.
No, that's his thing.
Abandoning everything that made the previous X-Men movies stand out and doing nothing new or exciting enough to justify its own existence. I actually think the idea of a smaller scale, character drama focused X-Men movie set in a creepy mental institution could have led to a good story. You'd need good dialogue for that though, and filmmakers who are good at utilizing smaller spaces and more claustrophobic settings, or any aspect of horror really. In an hour and a half, they attempt to flesh out a crew of 5 new characters, gradually explaining their sad backstories, and ending with an epic showdown with Anya Taylor-Joy, with her DeviantArt OC Purple Dragon fighting a demon bear.
Hey, Yogi!
Guess this is in the comics or something, but I didn't want or need this from a story of this scope. Deadpool and Logan single-handedly carried this franchise towards its end before the mouse murdered it, but if this and Dark Phoenix are the types of movies we were going to continue to get from them, I can't say I shed a tear for the X-Men side of Fox being devoured here. Even when I first watched this in 2020, it felt outdated and old. The reactive way the industry cast trending actors left this movie in an awkward place, with the 2 biggest actors coming from TV shows that weren't even currently relevant when this finally dropped. It's not a movie I would recommend to anyone, it's largely just boring. The only part I got anything out of was the bear fight at the end because I just wasn't expecting it to devolve into this kind of bullshit after the way it was sold in advertising. Mortal is a Norwegian film by director Andre Øvredal, sorry if I said that wrong, who I was familiar with having seen Trollhunter, The Autopsy of Jane Doe, and Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, 2 of which I fairly enjoyed when I first saw them. The best part of this movie is the setting and concept. The sweeping vistas of Norway acting as the backdrop for an intimate superhero mystery rooted in fascinating Norse mythology is a great starting off point. However, the way the story comes together is clumsy and limited in scope by its budget and writing. This is a story we've all seen countless times before, a scared, lonely main character who's experiencing fantastical powers, whose origins are a mystery, with the conflict arising from accidental injuries caused by these powers, as well as the government chasing after the main character to experiment on them. Pretty much every single beat is laid out in such an expected, obvious manner that it comes across as if it was made in a vacuum from its contemporaries. It's clearly inspired by. Forgetting stories like X-Men, Chronicle, hell, the MCU literally has Thor as a character, let alone lesser-known stories of the same ilk such as Midnight Special from 2016. Nothing illustrates this more than the ending of the movie where the main character learns he's a descendant of Thor, picking up his tiny Mjolnir and enacting a lamer version of the type of action we've been seeing from the MCU for years now. The setting here is not enough to carry how bland and meandering the story is, especially with the level of dialogue on display here.
I love fairies. It's like taking a break from the world for a few minutes.
The lead is played by Nat Wolff, older brother of Alex Wolff from Hereditary. God, they really look similar, don't they? Who does a perfectly fine job given the material, even if he's crying in nearly every other scene, so his character feels one note and exhausting after a while. It truly falls apart for me after they establish the character of Christine, who immediately falls in love with the main character to try and add some weight to the drama. Her dialogue in particular stood out to me for its bluntness.
Are you the next Jesus?
Take a shot every time she mentions that you can control your powers, as if she's Professor X or something.
If you learn how to control it.
You have to focus on what you can do and how how you can't control it. You learn how to control it.
There are some awkward mentions of religion and how a person appearing with this kind of power would dismantle our understanding of belief and myth, which is a thought-provoking topic to explore given the setup. It's largely wasted though through its on-the-nose dialogue.
Imagine Christians, Muslims, everyone who believes in a God.
The drama is just so clumsily constructed. For example, Christine figures out early on that intense emotions are what triggers Nat Wolff's Thor powers to pop off against his control. So, later on in the movie when she attempts to overtake a truck in the most dangerous and idiotic way possible, you understand this clearly only happens so there can be a scene where the powers destroy something from his intense emotions caused by her. It's fairly well directed, you can tell he's experienced and knows what he's doing, however there's never a point where the story feels like it's earned its own existence. Considering when the climax of the movie seems to be more of a setup for sequels instead of trying to tell a compelling self-contained story. It treats itself with the intensity of a horror movie with flashes of violence and a fairly dark tone. So much of it, however, relies on set pieces that are prioritized over character. The entire mystery side of the story is answered in an uninteresting exposition dump, just like a lot of bad horror movies do. As refreshing and stunning as the setting is, there simply isn't enough here to make an effective dark spin on the superhero genre, especially considering how spoiled we are for these types of movies in this ever-growing list of competition. Next. The most literal way to interpret David Bowie's song Heroes is a strange title to attach to Robert Rodriguez's latest entry into the Shark Boy and Lava Girl cinematic universe. No, I'm serious.
How about Shark Boy and Lava Girl?
Rodriguez has built a name for himself in Hollywood from his output of quickly made kids movies that he makes in his garden with a green screen. It feels like he's proven that he's capable of making good movies, so now he's happy living the life making Netflix-produced money laundering opportunities. The story of We Can Be Heroes is nearly identical to Spy Kids. The parents are the heroes, or spies, that get captured by the villain, so the kids have to save the parents. We've seen this all before. For whatever reason, the supreme laziness of these movies is almost charming to me. I genuinely kind of enjoy Spy Kids 3, especially for this reason. Half of the fun is seeing which random actors were around that day for Rodriguez to insert into the movie. Christian Slater, Pedro Pascal again, and that guy from Narcos and Logan. No Taylor Lautner though, which sucks. I'm gonna upload a trying to watch for this movie shortly after this goes up, so let's move on. The way Harley Quinn has been introduced to the big screen is so disappointing to me. I'm so sick of all these spin-off movies when we haven't even had the classic baseline stories told to us. Well, I suppose this is a half continuation of Suicide Squad?
Hey, I know that guy.
A movie that critically DC wants to forget, but monetarily wants to milk because, oh my god, why did Suicide Squad make so much money? But it's not even purely a Harley Quinn movie either, it's yet another team coming together to reference a random comic that no one has heard of movie. Birds of Prey is the title, or originally Birds of Prey and the Fantabulous Emancipation of One Harley Quinn. But hey, if that title is funny to you, you'll probably like this movie. Out of everything on this list, this is one of the few movies I could understand someone genuinely enjoying in some way. At least this one's more of a movie, and I understand the story clearer. It's just not very unique. And there's some okay action for action's sake. I'm fairly picky with action scenes and like to see some kind of hook or consequence or scope to what I'm seeing. The Raid 2, one of the best action movies ever, was apparently an influence, and talented stunt coordinators from the John Wick movies and other high-profile action films worked on the stunts here. So why doesn't it work for me? I guess action seems like a waste of time when there's no underlying tension or stakes, with an emphasis weighted more on the team coming together instead of just telling a more self-contained Harley movie. I actually quite enjoy the jumping off point for this movie. Dealing with a Harley who's just broken up with the Joker is a dramatic place to start a story, especially when the ex in question is this asshole. The problem for me is that this movie's going for an action comedy hot topic tone, and I simply don't find this kind of humor funny. And even with an actress as talented as Margot Robbie, every line has a 1 in 6 die roll chance of being the cringiest thing you've heard all day.
That felt pretty great.
Fake fucking fucks.
And this is a weighted die we're talking about here, so it tends to land on the same number quite a lot.
If you've ever watched any cop movie ever, you know that this is when shit gets real.
I mean, this is a pretty loud fucking shit show.
It reminds me of what Disney keep doing with their villain characters, where they have to make, like, Cruella de Vil have a sad backstory and make her a cool Venom anti-hero who works outside of the law but has their own moral code, even if she is a little kooky. So Harley's character is that she's a genius, expert acrobat who can fight her way out of any situation with her unmatched agility, but she's also an insane, ditzy murderer who everyone is scared of because she's the Joker's ex-girlfriend, and has a dense history of vicious crimes, and is so random she keeps a hyena in her apartment because reference, and is shown to us to barely have a grasp of reality. Why am I invested in Harley Quinn fighting prisoners to break out a little girl from jail? Oh, probably because Deadpool 2 basically did that, remember?
In the storytelling business, this dummy swallowing that diamond is called a complication.
When action isn't happening, there'll be some kind of humor, like the perfect egg sandwich set piece. Again, if it's hilarious to you that Harley Quinn cartoonishly waits for her favorite egg sandwich for ages, then drops it in slow motion, that's great. But for me, she's just not a strong enough force on her own to carry a film, not the way it was executed here anyway. I suppose the positioning of the movie annoys me more than anything, yet again prioritizing popular marketable characters and imagery instead of relying on a backbone of story or direction. Leading a cinematic universe with a Birds of Prey movie makes little sense to me. This seems more like a phase 3 or 4 type story that you tell once you actually have some characters established. I just wish they could have tried to be a wackier comedy or have more weight and consequence to the action, because where it currently sits is a middling tone that I don't enjoy. In fact, sitting through this movie for a second time for this video was honestly a chore. The biggest standout to me was actually the costume department doing something more creative with Harley's outfits. Mary Elizabeth Winstead is completely wasted here. I always forget she's in the movie for the middle chunk. The stuffed plot suffering from feeling the need to be a gang team-up movie. See, in an alternate universe where DC had their shit together, I could imagine a Harley Quinn, Poison Ivy movie that might work. Hell, James Gunn's version of Suicide Squad does a better job of characterizing and writing jokes for this same person, and that movie isn't even about her as directly. But that's not 2020, we're not talking about that yet. I just wish they'd spent more time developing the script and story more. This was written by the writer of Bumblebee, which was not my cup of tea at all, but Transformers fans seem to like it. There's enough at play here conceptually that could have been developed into a recommendable Harley Quinn movie that properly embraced the unreliable narrator and vibrant intensity of the character. A character like this needs a stronger sense of direction. It's a bit of a trend with these studio movies that gobble up indie filmmakers and put them on $100 million projects, where especially if they don't have experience working in the system, the big scope action scenes and effects work heavy sequences often feel like they were made by a crew that almost exists in a vacuum from the director. Now and again her voice does come through in some of the creative decisions, but overall the sense of style seems like a largely toned down version of whatever they were attempting to do in the original Suicide Squad. Okay, let's do a DC animated speed round. Usually I don't bother with a straight to video animated output, despite how they actually tend to adapt the stories I'd want to see on the big screen. Superheroes and animation go hand in hand way more naturally than live action to me, so I'm always searching for strong adaptations in this form despite how rare and low budget they tend to be. Superman Man of Tomorrow. Man of Tomorrow is DC rebooting the animated universe and kind of failing to keep me interested. The art direction is different compared to the Ben 10 looking ones, opting for a more frame-heavy, looser style, even using obvious rotoscoping at times, probably again for budgeting reasons. I enjoy them attempting a new style, but they clearly didn't have the time or budget necessary to flesh this out. The backgrounds stand out in particular for their flatness, as does the range and quality of the animation depending on the shot. I gave this half an hour to get me invested, but had to ultimately apply the 30-minute rule because I was bored out of my mind. Superman Red Sun. Conceptually, this is a great idea for a story. Superman landing in Russia instead of America is a really fun Elseworlds tale. I find 2 major points let it down though. First, the animation reminds me of Ben 10, and I can't get past it. This is mostly down to the character designs, art direction, and the budget. I was spoiled by the Bruce Timm DC stuff from the 90s, so my standards might be too high. The premise has a good hook, but it's so short that it doesn't leave much of an impression alongside an ultimately shallow story and forgettable narrative that feels like it would be better to read in a comic, where the artwork would also be much better. Justice League Dark Apocalypse War. Rounding off these movies is Apocalypse War, which has some pretty good moments. It's a fine Justice League story that kept me fairly entertained for its runtime. It is a sequel to 2017's Justice League Dark, which I never bothered with, but it's self-contained enough where I didn't feel too out of the loop. There is some horrendous, overly edgy dialogue that reads like they're trying too hard to be adult, which has always been a problem with these for me. They just can't quite get the tone right.
Fuck's sake.
Azeroth Metreon!
Looks like I get the last word. Suck it, bitches.
God, Netflix has been busy throwing their shit at the wall to see what sticks, haven't they? And this is definitely another superhero movie from 2020. The gimmick this time is that in this universe exists a pill that gives you unpredictable powers for 5 minutes before it runs out. The director duo responsible for this is Paranormal Activity and Catfish directors Henry Joost and Ariel Schulman, who randomly seem to be helming this star-studded Netflix push for a new franchise, starring Jamie Foxx, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, and Dominic Fishback, who was excellent in Judas and the Black Messiah. It's shot more like a music video than a movie, with the Jamie Foxx scenes being mostly action-based superhero fights with these temporary powers. Joseph Gordon-Levitt is a cop, so they can have the slowly developing procedural element of the story. Dominic Fishback plays a high school girl who uses rap to impress Jamie Foxx in one scene, going for a Last of Us surrogate daughter type relationship. It feels like a bunch of disparate inspirations slammed together. Especially the whole rap angle makes it feel like the writers just watched Blind Spotting and wanted to make that part of the movie for some reason, except they're already stuck with this silly superhero pill premise. It doesn't gel well together, the writing being the biggest standout problem to me. Banking on trite mystery elements anyone could guess a mile away, this just isn't a good story. Relying more on star power over anything of substance, and it takes a good 30 minutes for the dynamics of the story to get into motion. And by that point, you're already kind of checking out. Casey Neistat shows up for a bit, which is weird. It's just another one for the pile. The Boner Film Group gives us a fantastic Blur cutscene, which is the start of an expansive new cinematic universe based off the Valiant comics that is definitely going to continue into the future. Bloodshot is played by Vin Diesel, an elite soldier who is killed in battle and through the events of the movie finds out that his reality isn't quite what he's been led to believe. The most notable creative decision with this movie is the director, Dave Wilson, who comes from a background of working at Blur Studios, who specialize in pre-rendered video game cutscenes for the likes of games like Mass Effect 2, Halo Wars, or those pretty famously Old Republic cinematics. This is notable because it really shows in the movie, especially towards the end where it basically devolves into a Blur video game cutscene. This is one of the few movies on this list that has a story with a barely strong hook, and a narrative that actually has surprises and goes somewhere you might not expect. It doesn't amount to much, and the standards and expectations here are obviously extremely low based on the poster and advertising, but I surprisingly didn't get this as much as I was expecting. By no means is that a recommendation to check this out. There's still plenty of bad dialogue, terrible acting, awkward pacing, and stupid moments.
I saw my wife in a dream.
But I simply don't have the energy to feel any strong emotion about this one. That's more a comment on the absolute state of superhero movies in the year 2020 than it is a message that everyone was wrong about Bloodshot. Actually, you know what? Everyone was wrong about Bloodshot. Check it out. Now, I don't know if it's just the placement in this list that has me feeling weirdly positive about this movie, but I enjoyed this so much more than I was expecting. The idea of a team of immortals who can't die is a familiar premise that instantly reminded me of Highlander. However, the way the story follows through on the premise and pushes it to its logical extremes kept surprising me. This is probably largely based on the writing of the original comic, helmed by Greg Rucka, who found a fresh angle to expand and explore the ideas of people who cannot die and have lived for thousands of years into a fairly fun narrative. There's a concerted effort to clearly establish the ground rules of this immortality, with plenty of exposition trickling out the answers to most of the questions you would imagine would rob the story of any tension or stakes. I mean, they can't die.
I lead a group of immortals.
What I wasn't expecting as much was the focus on the relatable, emotional impact that the lack of death would have on a human psyche, including the clever decision of having the lead being an experienced Charlize Theron, who has the charisma and acting ability to give the sillier scenes weight, but in contrast also introduced an inexperienced character who has only just become immortal, so the audience can have the major questions that arise from the premise answered in somewhat logical exposition dumps.
So we really never die. Nothing that lives forever.
They do just enough to characterize each member of the group to make them memorable, and the way real human history is woven into the story through myths and witch trials was entertaining to me. There's definitely more to explore with this premise, which I'm sure the original comic does. I'm fairly tempted to give it a read because I could see the bones of something great here. What lets it down for me are some irritating creative choices that pull me out. The soundtrack in particular was a huge letdown, mostly relying on distracting electro-pop music with obvious lyrics that sometimes literally describe the imagery you're seeing. A missed opportunity to compose a score that reflects the timeless wisdom and mystery of the characters instead of trying to give it broad appeal, but I suppose this is Netflix we're talking about. Speaking of the Netflix formula, I find it odd that they didn't choose to adapt this into a miniseries instead of a movie. It seems perfect for that, and a lot less will probably be lost in translation. Although two of the best shows they've made in recent years will probably never get an ending, so at least the popularity of this means we might get a conclusion to the story. The villain of the story is ridiculously mustache twirly, played by Harry Melling. I actually really enjoy his acting when I've seen it, especially in Buster Scruggs and The Devil All the Time. I just wish the character had more going on that he could elevate, instead of a good character actor elevating a standard greater good evil scientist motivation that has to be overly maniacal for the story to happen. As much as I enjoyed Charlize Theron's arc in the plot, where she learns to not be a hopeless nihilist and to embrace the hard-to-measure generational change she was a part of influencing, I can't help but feel like there are still too many missed opportunities here. The action is okay, but doesn't give you too much of what the premise begs. I'm hoping that the sequel will be able to ramp up the story and build what was set up and established in a satisfying way. Although this is Netflix we're talking about, and their quality is about as inconsistent as my upload schedule. It's also violent and brooding, so in the words of Zack Snyder himself, this is a movie for grown-ups. Archenemy is a curious movie partially made possible thanks to Legion M, the first fan-funded entertainment company where you can directly invest in the making of the movie, allowing projects such as Mandy, Colossal, and a selection of other indie darlings to be made possible. A strong premise here, the story is centered around a homeless drunk who claims he's a superhero from another dimension, contrasted with a naive, optimistic character who believes in his story and wants to find out the truth and document it.
Cosmic blood. It came from something called the cosmic source.
The first act was the most entertaining. I found enjoyment from the humor and the grimy grindhouse style it was going for, with funny background gags like the henchman holding a Nihilism for Beginners book, and some ambitious dialogue that seems fairly self-aware of how ridiculous it can sound.
I punched through the molecules to create a vortex.
Once it detached from being a smaller stakes character drama and started delving into the Always Sunny crime angle, I slowly began to lose interest though, almost losing me completely with the way the story wraps up towards the end despite the odd twists and turns.
You look insane.
Obviously, there are huge budgetary restrictions here that hold the movie back from its potential. The idea of implementing animated sequences for the exposition scenes of Max Fist explaining his backstory is the kind of creativity I like to see. It leaves the mystery element intact and breaks up the visuals in a stimulating neon approach. It's the execution that lets it down though. They clearly did not have the means to properly explore this idea. Animation is ridiculously expensive, so these scenes wind up closer to a motion comic than fully realized animated action. These smaller movies obviously cannot compete with Marvel or whatever in terms of big action spectacle, but they do have a chance to shine in gritty drama scenes with blood and violence, which you get plenty of from this movie. Joe Manganiello largely carries this on his back, as does the sense of style and character.
Are you ready?
There are just too many caveats for me to enthusiastically recommend this movie because I probably won't be watching this again. The weirder and more experimental these superhero movies are willing to go is exactly what is needed to liven up this repetitive space of movies though, so I'll always respect it for that. All in all, like 2020 itself, a pretty bad time. It's moments like this where I yearn for a year like 2017, where it was mostly the type of superhero content I actually want to see. The Boys Season 2 was probably my favourite superhero project of that year, continuing on the grimy commentary with such a commitment to its exaggerated nature, but it continued to stand out against the crowd. It's not a movie though. As far as what I'm excited for from 2021 that I haven't seen yet, Venom Carnage 1 is obviously the main pick for me, alongside Spider-Man Away from His Place. He's probably my favourite superhero at this point. Venom, that is.